A young woman, alone in a cold, dark room, faced with a decision no one should ever have to make. In the silence of the night, her world is turned upside down, and a life hangs in the balance. What would you do if you found yourself in that moment? Today, I'm sharing a story of love, sacrifice, and redemption, a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about family and forgiveness. Stay with me as I uncover the truth, one piece at a time. And before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a moment of this incredible journey from African legacy tales. Caroline Williams, just 20 years old, gasps in pain as she clings to the worn blanket covering her legs. She is alone in a cold, dark corner of her parents' mansion basement. The damp stone walls seem to close in on her, suffocating every breath. Her body trembles, but not from the cold, it is fear, anguish, and emptiness that consume her. In front of her, the nurse hired by her parents doesn't even glance her way, she simply prepares her instruments, ready to bring forth a secret that should not exist. Caroline's cries blend with the sound of dry leaves beating against the basement windows. The atmosphere is suffocating, almost surreal, and the thick air fills the small space, illuminated only by the faint light of a lamp. Can you imagine the desperation in that moment? Caroline, barely conscious, feels life slipping away from her body, but her eyes remain fixed on the tiny being she has just brought into the world, a boy, her boy. The nurse, with mechanical precision and without a word, cuts the umbilical cord. Caroline whispers, her voice broken, "I'm sorry." She knew her words wouldn't change anything. She had been swept away by a current of others' decisions, a prisoner of her parents' iron grip. Richard and Susan. She felt as though her life had always been a shadow, a forced representation of perfection. But in that basement, there was nothing perfect, only cold, pain, and shame. Richard and Susan waited in the upper salon, distant and resolute. The nurse, unfazed by the young mother's despair, wrapped the baby in an old blanket, oblivious to the fragile life she held in her hands. Richard had made the instructions clear: there should be no witnesses, no trace of what had happened, everything must disappear as if that baby had never existed. Caroline stretched out her arm in a desperate attempt to hold on to the only thing she felt was hers, but her body was already failing her. Tears slid down her face as her fingers barely grazed the empty air where her son had been. The basement door slammed shut, leaving behind the echo of her helplessness. The nurse walked through the chilly autumn night, leaves crunching under her feet as she walked leisurely, as if this task, delivering the baby to darkness, were as routine as any other. The baby, still wrapped in the blanket, continued to cry, a wail resonating in the silence of the deserted streets. In her mind, there was no remorse, no doubt, her function was to follow orders, and the orders were clear: get rid of him. Without pausing to look around, she left the newborn in a trash bin a few steps away from a lonely corner. The blanket barely covered the tiny body that trembled in the cold dawn. Without a backward glance, the nurse walked away. Could this abandoned child survive the night? No one heard his cries, no one saw the pain of that defenseless creature thrown into the world without protection or affection. The Williams mansion remained lit in the distance, oblivious to the crime they had just committed in the name of appearances. Inside the mansion, Richard Williams closed the salon curtains with firm hands, the precise gesture of a man used to controlling every aspect of his life. Susan sat on the sofa, her expression blank, watching the crackling fire in the fireplace. There was no comfort between them, nor did they need it. "This was the right thing to do," Richard said, his voice firm, as if those words could seal the fate of his grandchild. Richard and Susan had concealed Caroline's pregnancy from everyone, not even their staff knew, though they suspected. Hours later, when Susan finally dared to descend to the basement, she found her daughter's lifeless body. The infection, unnoticed until it was too late, consumed her. The reality of what they had done hit Susan like a wave, and her heart-wrenching scream echoed throughout the house. She knelt beside Caroline, her trembling hands touching her pale, cold face, tears falling onto her lifeless skin. "Richard," she screamed desperately, sobbing as her mind struggled to grasp the magnitude of what had just happened. "We have to save the baby, we can't do this, we can't." Richard appeared in the basement doorway, his face tense yet unmoving. He showed no emotion upon witnessing the scene before him. To him, this was a tragedy, yes, but one that had to be kept under control. There was no room for chaos or regret. "It's too late, Susan," he replied, his voice cold as ice. "This is what we had to do, we can't change it now." Susan looked at him in disbelief, unable to comprehend how her husband could be so distant, so insensitive. Inside, she felt something break irreparably as she clung to her daughter's lifeless body. She wondered if she would ever be able to forgive herself for all that she had done. She had allowed fear, shame, and social pressure to lead her to this abyss, and now the price she had paid was the life of her daughter and the uncertain fate of her grandchild. Richard's words barely registered in her mind as he walked away from the basement, closing the door behind him as if everything could simply vanish. But Susan knew the truth. She knew this weight, this guilt, would accompany her for the rest of her life. The night is dark, and the cold wind lashes the deserted streets. Charlotte walks back to her small apartment after a long day working in the Williams mansion. She is exhausted, as always, but something inside her feels restless. The weight of endless chores in her employer's home had never troubled her so much as it did tonight. There is a knot in her chest that she doesn't understand, an inexplicable feeling that pushes her to keep walking through the empty streets. Guided by an instinct she barely comprehends, the sound stops her in her tracks. A cry, barely audible, pierces the silence of the night. Charlotte stands frozen, her eyes focusing on the dark alley a few meters away. The wailing is weak, fragile, but persistent. Something inside her jolts awake, an urgency she cannot ignore. Her previously weary steps now quicken, almost desperate. She ventures into the alley, and there, among the shadows, she sees it. The trash bin covered in graffiti and overflowing with refuse seems to be the source of that cry. Charlotte, her heart pounding in her chest, approaches. Her hands tremble as she lifts the lid. What she sees inside leaves her paralyzed for an eternal second. There, among plastic bags and food scraps, lies a baby, small, helpless, his pale skin almost blue from the cold. The crying, though faint, still persists, as if that tiny life were clinging to its last thread of hope. Charlotte is breathless. She can't comprehend how someone could do something so cruel, so heartless. But she doesn't have time to process it. Without thinking, without even questioning herself, she plunges her hands into the container and gently lifts the baby. The child barely weighs anything, his body is cold to the touch, and Charlotte feels something in her heart shatter into a million pieces. She wraps him in her jacket as best as she can, shielding him from the biting wind. As she cradles him in her arms, something shifts inside her, a spark of protection she hasn't felt in a long time. With the baby in her arms, Charlotte knows only one thing for sure: she won't let him die. She strides quickly toward her apartment, her thoughts racing just as fast. The baby has calmed a bit in her embrace, his breathing is still irregular but less desperate. Charlotte enters her small apartment, a modest yet warm space with old furniture and faded walls. She carefully places the baby on the sofa and rushes to find blankets. She wraps him up, cradling him in her arms. For the first time in a long while, Charlotte feels an inexplicable connection with someone. The child, now covered in a soft blanket, begins to breathe more steadily. Charlotte sits at the edge of her bed, gazing at him, tears filling her eyes. She can't take her eyes off him, off his tiny face that reflects so much pain, so much loneliness, despite being just a newborn. "I'll call you Ethan," she murmurs softly, stroking his little head. Ethan, a new beginning. The baby remains silent, his eyes half open, almost as if he understands the meaning of the words she has just bestowed upon him. Charlotte feels something ignite within her, a determination she has never experienced so strongly. She has decided this baby will be hers, that she will protect him at all costs, even if he isn't her blood. She will raise him as if he were, love him in a way that no one else has. It's a silent promise made in the darkness of a night that changed her life forever. That first night is long. Ethan, exhausted from the cold and abandonment, sleeps deeply in a makeshift crib Charlotte has fashioned from cushions and old blankets. Every now and then, she leans in to ensure he's still breathing, that he's okay. As she watches him, she can't help but think about how unfair the world is, how someone so innocent and fragile could be discarded as if they were worthless. But Charlotte won't allow that to be Ethan's story. The next morning, sunlight barely filters through the small window of the apartment as Charlotte begins to move around the kitchen. Her salary as a housekeeper barely covers her needs, and now she has a new challenge, Ethan. With his soft skin and tiny fists clenched, he needs care, needs food, and above all, needs a future. Charlotte knows it won't be easy, but she's not willing to give up, not after everything she's been through. As she prepares an improvised bottle with the little milk she has in her fridge, her mind races. How is she going to do this? She's an immigrant, barely scraping by for herself, and the system won't be kind if they discover what she's done. But every time she looks at Ethan, everything else fades away. Only he matters, his well-being, his life. The milk slowly fills the bottle, and Charlotte sighs. She knows the decision she's made won't be easy. Ethan is a child who was born into a world that rejected him from his very first breath, yet she, with her modest apartment and a heart full of scars, will do the impossible to ensure the child has a better life. She will give him what he was denied, a life full of love, protection, and above all, a chance. Charlotte holds the bottle in front of Ethan, who moves his tiny mouth seeking the warmth and sustenance that has finally come to him. As he begins to drink slowly, Charlotte smiles, her heart brimming with emotions she doesn't know. She doesn't know what the future holds for them, but in this moment, in this place, she is certain of one thing: Ethan has found a home, and she has found a reason to fight. The sound of the bell at the coffee shop rang every time someone entered or exited, but Charlotte no longer flinched. She had grown accustomed to the atmosphere of the little place where she had worked for several years. Life in the cafe was chaotic, but nothing compared to the weight she had felt for so many years working for the Williams family. Deciding to quit her old job had been difficult, but she knew she couldn't keep serving that family after what had happened. Quitting had been an act of freedom, a breath of fresh air. With Ethan by her side, every step she took had a greater purpose. She had found in this modest job the stability she needed, with hours that allowed her to care for her son better. Though some nights were long and lonely, her life now had a meaning she had never imagined before. Ethan, for his part, had grown healthy and strong. At 6 years old, he was a curious boy full of energy, with a spirit that lit up any place he entered. Charlotte watched him run, jump, and ask about everything he saw, and her heart swelled with pride. In his eyes, there was no pain or resentment, only innocence. To him, Charlotte had always been his mother, the only one he knew, the only one who hugged him at the end of the day, tucked him in at night, and read him stories until he fell asleep. But there was something beginning to trouble Ethan, something that even Charlotte couldn't hide forever. One afternoon, while playing at the park near the cafe, Ethan was confronted with a truth he didn't yet know how to process. "Why is your mom black and you white?" one of the kids he was playing with asked. The question caught him off guard. Ethan stopped dead in his tracks, looking at the child with a mix of confusion and bewilderment. What did that mean? To him, Charlotte was his mom, and he had never thought of skin color as something that separated them. But now that question echoed in his mind, over and over, as he made his way home. That night, in their small apartment, Ethan curled up on the sofa, watching Charlotte as she prepared dinner. The question tormented him, but he didn't know how to phrase it. Finally, when Charlotte sat down beside him, he looked at her intently and with a trembling voice asked, "Mom, why am I different from you?" Charlotte felt her heart stop for a moment. She knew this moment would come, but she wasn't ready for it. She had tried to protect him from the truth for so many years. She took a deep breath and looked into his son's eyes, those eyes she loved so much, the same ones he had seen for the first time on that cold night when he found him abandoned. "Ethan," she began, searching for the right words, "there are things about your story that you still don't understand, and I know it's difficult, but the most important thing you should know is that I love you. I loved you since the very first moment I held you in my arms." Ethan furrowed his brow, trying to process what his mother was saying. The comment at school still lingered in his mind. "But why am I white, Mom?" Charlotte felt tears welling up, but she held them back. She couldn't break down in front of Ethan. She leaned down and hugged him tightly, as if that simple act could protect him from the truth for just a little longer. "Ethan, what matters is not the color of our skin, what matters is that we are a family. You are my son, and you always will be, despite everything." Despite everything, the bond between Charlotte and Ethan only grew stronger. Charlotte worked long hours at the cafe, sacrificing her own well-being to ensure Ethan had everything he needed. She fed him, dressed him, and even though resources were always scarce, she never let Ethan feel unloved or unsupported. Whenever he had a doubt or concern, Charlotte was there to listen, to guide him with her quiet wisdom and unbreakable strength. Ethan grew up surrounded by Charlotte's love, but he also began to develop his own ambitions. He observed the exhaustion in his mother's eyes when she came home late from work, the time she stayed up late reviewing bills or planning how to stretch the money until the end of the month. Those scenes left a profound mark on him. In his young mind, a clear purpose formed. He wanted to help his mother, he wanted to give back everything she had done for him. "Mom, when I grow up, I'm going to be a doctor," Ethan said one day while they were having breakfast at their small kitchen table. Charlotte looked at him in surprise. "A doctor?" she asked, smiling. "And why a doctor?" Ethan looked at her seriously, an expression he rarely showed. "Because I want to take care of you. I want to make sure nothing bad happens to you." Charlotte felt a mix of pride and sadness. She knew her son was growing up, and with that growth would come more questions and uncertainties. But for now, that simple desire of Ethan to become a doctor, to take care of her, filled her heart with joy. Years passed, and Ethan became a bright, determined young man with an empathy that reflected everything Charlotte had taught him. Despite the challenges, despite the differences that others saw between them, their mutual love remained the force that kept them united. Although the weight of the truth lingered in the air, Charlotte knew that as long as Ethan had the love and values she had instilled in him, nothing could separate them. However, Charlotte also understood that the day the truth came to light was getting closer. Ethan was smart, and the world would not be kind when he finally learned the secrets of his origins. Ethan's adolescence was not what he had imagined. As he grew, so did the discomfort he felt when the world looked at him with that strange gaze, that gaze that judged him for something he still didn't fully comprehend. In middle school, the differences between him and Charlotte not only became more evident but also became a topic of conversation among peers and teachers alike. While some comments were subtle, others were direct and cruel, the whispered laughs behind his back, the gossip among classmates, all piled up like a heavy burden on his shoulders. They called him the white son of the black lady, and although he tried to ignore them, the words hurt. He couldn't help but wonder why he was different, why his skin was so different from his mother's. Every time he looked at Charlotte, he felt the love and connection they had shared since he could remember, but he also felt the growing pressure of questions he had so far managed to suppress. One day, after a particularly tough day at school, when a group of boys confronted him with hurtful comments about his black mother, Ethan returned home with a mix of frustration and confusion. The atmosphere in their small apartment was calm, as always, with the familiar aroma of the food Charlotte had prepared in the air. But this time, that comfort that usually calmed him wasn't enough. He sat down at the table, but instead of eating, he silently watched his mother, trying to gather the courage to ask the question he had been avoiding for so long. Finally, the words escaped his lips almost without him realizing it. "Mom, why are we different?" he asked with a mix of pain and curiosity in his voice. Charlotte, who was serving the food, froze. She knew this moment would come sooner or later, but still, the impact of the question was stronger than she expected. She looked into Ethan's eyes and saw not just her son but a young man desperately seeking answers she had tried to protect him from all his life. "Ethan," she began, her throat tightening, "there are things that I haven't been able to tell you yet, not because I don't want to, but because it's not the right time." Ethan looked at her, his face a mix of disbelief and frustration. He had expected more from that answer. "Not the right time," he repeated, a hint of bitterness in his tone. "When will it be the right time, Mom? I'm not a kid anymore. People at school are asking me, looking at me weird. I need to know." Charlotte sat down across from him, gently taking his hands in hers. Her eyes were sadness, but also a firm resolve. "I know, son, I know it's hard, and I promise you that one day you will understand everything. But please, trust me, it's still not the right time for you to know." Ethan, although disappointed, lowered his head. He wanted to understand, but the love he felt for Charlotte kept him from pressing her further. He accepted her answer, but deep down, he knew that something significant was being kept from him. The seed of doubt had been planted, and with each passing day, it grew stronger inside him. Despite that uncertainty, Ethan decided to focus on the one thing that gave him a sense of purpose: his studies. Since he was little, he had dreamed of being a doctor, of being able to take care of people just as Charlotte had taken care of him. That determination helped him ignore the voices surrounding him, to push aside the doubts about his identity, and concentrate on what truly mattered. He wanted to succeed, not just for himself, but for Charlotte, the woman who had saved him, raised him with all the love in the world despite the difficulties. Day after day, Ethan immersed himself in his books, spending hours in the library, solving math problems, reading about biology and anatomy, slowly building the path toward his dream. His teachers noticed his dedication and brilliance in his studies, and many encouraged him to keep going, to seek opportunities beyond the walls of that small high school. Charlotte, for her part, watched her son with silent pride. She knew Ethan was destined for great things, though her heart broke at the thought of the day she would have to reveal the truth about his origins. She also knew her son possessed a strength that could not be easily broken. She had raised him with values that transcended race or the circumstances of his birth. She had taught him empathy, compassion, and above all, to fight for what he wanted. Finally, after years of hard work, Ethan's dedication bore fruit. One afternoon, while going through the mail, he found an envelope with the logo of the state university. He opened it with trembling hands, feeling as if his future depended on the words written on that piece of paper. As his eyes scanned the letter and saw the words "full scholarship," he felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. He ran to Charlotte, who was in the kitchen as always, and showed her the letter with a smile he couldn't hide. "I did it, Mom," he exclaimed, his eyes shining. "I got the scholarship." Charlotte turned toward him, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at her son, the boy she had found abandoned, now transformed into a young man full of promise. She hugged him tightly, feeling a mix of pride, relief, and deep down, a shadow of sadness. She knew Ethan was about to start a new chapter in his life, one that would take him far away from her, but she also knew it was what was best for him. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan," she whispered as she held him close. "For you are everything I ever dreamed of and more." Ethan looked at her, and for a moment, all the doubts and questions about his origins faded away. In that instant, the only thing that mattered was that he had achieved his goal, and he had done it for the woman who had raised him with love and sacrifice. But even though the future seemed bright, both knew that the truth remained latent, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. And when that moment came, it would change their lives forever. The years at university had been a roller coaster of emotions for Ethan. Despite the initial difficulties of adapting to a completely new environment, his passion for medicine and his desire to help Charlotte kept him focused. Every class, every exam, every step brought him closer to his dream of becoming a doctor. But there was always a shadow following him. The questions about his origins, about the truth that Charlotte had yet to reveal, lingered in the corners of his mind, though he tried to ignore them. One day, during his third year, an unexpected opportunity arose. Ethan was selected to participate in a prestigious medical research program abroad, an experience that would not only strengthen his career but also expose him to new cultures and techniques in the field of medicine. The excitement he felt was immense, but at the same time, a knot formed in his chest. Leaving meant distancing himself from Charlotte, the only family he had ever known. Though Charlotte had always been strong and capable, the simple act of leaving her alone filled him with worry. That night, after receiving the news, Ethan sat with Charlotte in the small living room of their apartment. He had grown. He was no longer the child she had found in that garbage container. Now he was a young adult, determined and passionate, but in that moment, his eyes showed a vulnerability he hadn't revealed in years. "Mom, I got an offer to go abroad," he said, looking at the floor as he spoke. "It's a great opportunity, but I don't know if I should go. I don't want to leave you alone." Charlotte watched him in silence for a few seconds before smiling with that tenderness that only a mother can show. She moved closer to him and took his hands, just as she had done so many times when he was little. "Ethan, my love, this is your opportunity. I can't let you turn it down because of me. I'll be fine, I've always been fine, and I always will be. This is your dream, and I'll be here waiting for your return, just like always." Charlotte's words were simple but loaded with meaning. Ethan knew she was right. This was his chance to move forward, to grow. And although the thought of being away from her made him uneasy, he couldn't let such an important opportunity slip away. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered, hugging her tightly. "I promise I'll be okay." Charlotte hugged him back, feeling the weight of the words she had yet to speak, the truths that would someday have to come to light. But it wasn't the time yet, not now. Ethan departed weeks later, filled with expectations and dreams to fulfill. The months he spent abroad were revealing in many ways. He learned more than he had ever imagined and met people who profoundly influenced him. Yet, despite everything, there was always a void, a sense that something was missing, and that something was Charlotte. When he finally returned home, it felt as if time had flown by. He was more prepared than ever for his future as a doctor, and the first thing he did was seek an internship at the local hospital. There, he hoped to apply everything he had learned while also being close to Charlotte, who welcomed him back with open arms and a smile only a proud mother could show. His time at the hospital was challenging but rewarding. Each day presented new cases, new lives to care for. However, nothing could prepare him for what was about to happen. One day, while working in the emergency room, an elderly man was brought in after suffering a heart attack. The chaos of the situation left little room for questions. Ethan, along with the medical team, focused on stabilizing the patient. He was an older man with weathered features, gray hair, and a look of pain on his face. Although Ethan didn't know him, something inside him stirred, a strange sense of familiarity, a feeling he couldn't explain. During the treatment, the patient urgently needed a blood transfusion. It was a critical situation, and the hospital didn't have enough of the rare blood type the man required. Without thinking twice, Ethan offered to donate. He knew he shared that rare blood type, something he had discovered years earlier during a medical checkup but had never given much thought to before. The procedure was quick, and the patient managed to stay stabilized thanks to the transfusion. However, the real surprise came later, when the test results revealed something unexpected. The patient and Ethan shared more than just a rare blood type. There was a genetic match suggesting a familial relationship. Ethan, incredulous, reviewed the results again and again. It couldn't be a coincidence. His mind began racing in every direction, searching for an explanation. Who was this man? Why did he feel as though he knew him even though he had never seen him before? The following days were filled with confusion and questions. Ethan couldn't concentrate on his work, he couldn't stop thinking about that strange connection. Finally, he decided to speak with the patient, a man named Richard Williams. During a tense conversation, Ethan mentioned the coincidence and their test results, hoping for an answer that would help him understand what was happening. Richard, visibly shaken by the revelation, looked at him with a mix of surprise and fear. At first, he was reluctant to talk, but something in Ethan's eyes compelled him to do so. "I don't know how to tell you this, kid," Richard said, his voice breaking, "but I think I know who you are, and if it's true, I'm your grandfather." Richard's words hit Ethan like a bombshell. Everything inside him crumbled in an instant. The world he had known, the life he had lived up until that moment, suddenly felt like a lie. The truth that Charlotte had kept hidden for so many years was beginning to surface in the most unexpected way. Ethan fell silent, unable to process what he had just heard. His biological grandfather stood in front of him, a man he didn't know, yet somehow had been connected to his life from the very beginning. Ethan entered his small apartment with his mind tangled in 1,000 thoughts. The conversation with Richard Williams echoed in his head over and over, like an impossible refrain. How was it possible that this man was his biological grandfather? What did it all mean? The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but none fit perfectly. He felt there was a crucial part of the story that he still lacked, and he knew there was only one person who could help him understand: Charlotte. When he walked in, he found her sitting on the couch, a cup of tea in her hands. She smiled at him, but that smile quickly faded when she noticed the expression on his face. Ethan sat across from her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence was heavy, tense, filled with unanswered questions. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Mom, today I met a man at the hospital, a patient who had a heart attack. His name is Richard Williams." He paused, searching Charlotte's face for any reaction. He found it immediately. Charlotte tensed, her fingers gripping the cup tightly, and her eyes, usually warm, filled with a mix of surprise and pain. Ethan continued, "We had some tests done, and it seems we share more than just a blood type. He told me he thinks he's my grandfather." Charlotte looked down, unable to meet her son's gaze. For so many years, she had dreaded this moment. She knew that one day the truth would come to light, but she had never imagined it would happen this way. She felt a pang in her heart. Everything she had done to protect Ethan, everything she had kept silent about, was about to be revealed. "Ethan," she said softly, struggling to maintain her composure, "there's something I've kept for a long time, something I've wanted to tell you, but I never found the right moment." She lifted her gaze and saw the confusion and pain in her son's eyes, which filled her with immense guilt. "It's time for you to know the truth." Ethan felt a knot in his stomach. He knew that what he was about to hear would change everything, but he wasn't prepared for what was coming. Charlotte took a deep breath before continuing. "Many years ago, when I worked as a maid in the Williams household, I overheard something I couldn't ignore. One night, after a long day of work, as I walked through the streets near the mansion, I heard the cries of a baby. It was weak, but persistent. I approached a trash container, and there, among the refuse, I found you. It was you, Ethan." Charlotte's words struck Ethan like a punch to the gut. His heart raced, and for a moment, the air in the room seemed to disappear. He couldn't process what he had just heard, him, abandoned in a trash container. Charlotte continued, her voice trembling with emotion, "I didn't know where you came from or who your parents were. At that moment, all I knew was that I couldn't leave you there. I picked you up and took you home. I decided to care for you, to raise you as if you were mine, because in that moment, I knew you had been abandoned, that someone had discarded you as if you were worthless. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, but she didn't try to stop them. Over time, I discovered that you had been abandoned by your own grandparents, Richard and Susan Williams, the same people for whom I worked. They didn't want society to know that their daughter had a child in secret, so they decided to get rid of you. Ethan could barely breathe. The room seemed to spin around him as Charlotte's words settled in his mind. Everything he thought he knew about his life, everything he believed he understood, was crumbling in that instant. He felt a mix of pain, rage, confusion, and a betrayal he couldn't describe. His own grandparents had abandoned him, the people who he thought were supposed to protect and love him had left him to die. How could they do that to me?" he murmured, almost in a whisper, looking at Charlotte with tears in his eyes. "How can someone do that to their own grandchild?" Charlotte shook her head, unable to answer. She had struggled with that question for years, but she knew there was no answer that could alleviate the pain Ethan felt at that moment. All she could do was offer him the truth, even if it was devastating. Charlotte also told Ethan about his biological mother, Caroline, who had died after giving birth. "All I can say, Ethan, is that I chose you. From the moment I found you, I knew I would do everything I could to give you a dignified life. I may not be your biological mother, but I love you as if I were. Every day I spent with you, every sacrifice I made, I did it with love." She leaned towards him, taking his hands in hers. "I can't change what they did, but I can promise you that I never, not for a second, left you alone." Ethan turned his gaze away, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he had just heard. The betrayal he felt from his biological grandparents consumed him, but there was something else as well. Amid the whirlwind of emotions, a deep sense of gratitude began to emerge. Charlotte had not only saved him physically, she had given him everything she had. She had given him a life, a home, and unconditional love. She had sacrificed so much so he could be where he was now. He looked at Charlotte, and in that moment, despite the pain, he knew that although his life had begun with betrayal, it had also been marked by a love that many would never come to know. "Thank you, Mom," he said, his voice breaking but sincere. "Thank you for everything you did for me. I don't know how to thank you enough." Charlotte hugged him, and for a moment, all the weight of the truth hung suspended. The scars they both carried were evident, but so was the love that had sustained them for so many years. Ethan knew the truth hurt, but he also understood that in the end, what truly mattered was Charlotte's love, the woman who had chosen to save him when no one else would. But as the embrace lingered, a new question arose in his mind. Now that he knew the truth, what would he do with it? Ethan walked down the hospital corridor with firm steps, but inside, a storm of emotions consumed him. The conversation he had had with Charlotte kept echoing in his mind. The truth that had been hidden for so long had finally come to light, and with it, an open wound he didn't know how to heal. The betrayal from his biological grandparents haunted him, but more than anything, he felt an uncontrollable need to confront Richard Williams, the man who had abandoned him. When he arrived at Richard's room, he paused in front of the door for a moment, taking a deep breath and trying to muster the courage for what he was about to do. He didn't know exactly what to expect from this conversation, but he knew he could no longer live with the questions that tormented him. It was time to get answers. He opened the door slowly and stepped inside. Richard was sitting on the bed, weariness etched on his aged face. He looked up when he saw Ethan enter, and for a moment, the silence between them was overwhelming. Richard knew that the confrontation was inevitable. Ethan wasted no time. He stood before his grandfather and, without preamble, began to speak. "I need to know why," he said, his voice filled with a mix of contained rage and desperation. "I need to know why you abandoned me. How could you leave me in a trash bin? How could you look at your own grandson and decide he was worthless?" Richard, taken aback by the intensity of Ethan's words, lowered his head. He knew this moment would come, But he didn't have the answers that could ease his grandson's pain. For years, he had carried the weight of that decision, one that had consumed him little by little. "Ethan, there's nothing I can say to justify what I did," Richard began, his voice hoarse and trembling. "All I can tell you is that I was a coward. I let fear and shame blind me. At that moment, I cared more about what society thought of our family than about your life, and every day of my life, I've regretted that decision." Ethan clenched his fists, feeling a mix of compassion and anger. Part of him wanted to scream at him, to tell him that regret wasn't enough, that the scars he had left would never disappear. But another part, a more humane one, understood that Richard was just a man broken by his own mistakes. "And Susan?" Ethan asked, his voice heavy with resentment. "Did she feel the same? Did she also care more about what people thought than about my life?" Richard shook his head, and Ethan noticed the glimmer of tears in his eyes. "Susan has suffered every day since we made that decision," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She didn't want it to happen, but we were both trapped in our fear. It was she who, all these years, has been searching for you in secret, hoping that one day we could make amends for the mistake we made. You have no idea how much she has suffered because of this." Ethan looked at him, trying to process what he had just heard. Part of him had imagined his grandparents as cold, devoid of emotion, but now he faced the reality that they too had lived with the consequences of their actions. Though he couldn't forgive what they had done, he began to understand that regret and pain were part of that story. "I can't forgive you for what you did," Ethan said firmly, "but I want to understand. I want to know why, because no matter how much I hate it, you are part of my story, and I can't ignore that." Richard nodded, tears rolling down his cheeks. He knew he didn't deserve Ethan's forgiveness, but the simple fact that his grandson wanted to understand gave him a glimmer of hope for redemption. "The only thing I can say, Ethan, is that I failed you. I failed as a father, I failed as a grandfather.